Welcome to Equilibrium Echoes, the podcast where we delve into the transformative power of your inner world on your relationships. I'm your host, Alyssa Decker. Join me as we unlock the secrets of emotional equilibrium and dig deep into the tools and insights needed to foster healthier, more fulfilling relationships in ways that feel safe and authentic. Welcome back to Equilibrium Echoes. I'm your host, Alyssa Decker, and today I have with me Michelle Burbidge and a guest from, as we've just been discussing, Nova Scotia. I do not know what it is about Equilibrium Echoes, but we seem to have made friends with the Canadians here on the show. So Michelle is, you can find her at newperceptionwellness.com. She is a coach and does so much more than the term coaching implies. So Michelle, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm an integrative healing practitioner, and what that is we look at functional medical lab tests. So we can get a really complete picture on what's going on inside your body, what's going on with, predominantly from my perspective, I work with mental health, a lot of people with ADHD and a lot of people who are neurodivergent or otherwise just stuck in survival mode. We can't get out of it. And so we look at, what's missing in your body. We look at what your neurotransmitters are doing. We look at your genetics, and we correlate all that information in order to provide supplementation that is most beneficial for you so that your body can get back to being in equilibrium and in a balanced state. So we also use other things. We use vagus nerve tools to get your nervous system back in alignment. We use inner child work in order to work on false beliefs, because that's important. And all those things are really important to work on in synthesis, so that when we start moving one or two, then the other will move as well in the right direction.
Oh, I love that. So you are, there's an element of coaching, but there's a whole lot more like medical research based. What is your title? I called you a coach, and that might not be correct. So tell me what you call yourself.
Yeah, so I'm actually a practitioner. So I'm an integrative healing practitioner. Yeah, so there is an element of coaching to what I do for sure, but a lot of it is interpretation and analysis, and then working with. It's not therapy, but it is working with some of the traumas that we hold in our bodies and moving that out. So coaching is more of working with people who in a way that we say, okay, well, what are your goals and where do you want to go? And this is more of a path. My book is actually called The 5-Step Path. And so I sort of show people, because when you're in survival mode, sometimes it's really difficult to know where you are or what you want. And so sometimes what you need is someone to just take you by the hand and say, okay, I'm going to show you exactly where to place your feet. Because in this moment, you're not able to figure that out for yourself. So, and then once we get to the point where we're at a good baseline and we're back up to where we need to be, which we call like a ventral vagal state, which is rest and reset, then we can look at doing coaching at that stage. So whether they want to go on to work with another a life coach or something like that, then they're at the state where that's able to take root and really have an effect. Yeah.
That's awesome. I really like that, because there oftentimes are a lot more factors than just mindset and inner work and all of that stuff. So you really bring in the medical aspect of that, and I think that's fantastic. You sound very knowledgeable and well trained. So I apologize for not asking you your title ahead of time.
That's fine.
But thank you for the explanation. So when we talked earlier, one of the things that we talked about that I really want to focus on today is the idea of survival mode, what that looks like, and how to know if you're in it, how to get out of it, and all of that, because I think this is something that it's a place a lot of us find ourselves, and we don't even know that we're there. Like in my experience, I spent 10 years in survival mode in a marriage, and in an abusive marriage, and I didn't even know that that's what it looked like. I thought I was just getting up and trudging through each day. And some of the stories that I told myself were things like, marriage is just hard, and then the kids are young and it'll get better. But it didn't have to be like that. So I would love for you to like kind of define for us, paint a picture of what survival mode looks like, what it looks like mentally as well as physically.
Yeah, so survival mode starts really a lot earlier than when we get into survival mode. So it starts really when we're little, and we have all of these experiences with other people where other people are expressing their emotions, and we don't understand what those emotions are and why they would have any other reason other than the fact that we caused it. So we internalize those things, and we sort of have these beliefs that follow us through our whole life, and we believe that different things. We believe that we're bothersome, we believe that we're not worthy, we believe that we don't deserve love, and we don't walk around with these in our head all the time, but our actions, people pleasing and not being able to hold firm boundaries or even set firm boundaries, all of those kinds of things, guilt and shame, those sort of happen throughout our lives. And as women particularly, women have a different experience of survival mode than men. And what we try to do, a lot of us are very high functioning throughout our lives. We're trying to prove ourselves. We're trying to prove our worth. We're trying to show ourselves that we're deserving of love. And so we're some of us are perfectionists. Some of us just really try hard to keep up with the image that we're supposed to be portraying. And lately we see it a lot more because we're seeing it on social media. And so all of our friends maybe are talking about the new thing that we're supposed to be doing, and how we're supposed to be keeping our homes and how we're supposed to be parenting our children, and all of this. I call it shoulding on ourselves. I didn't make that up, but that's what we call it. And every time we use the word should, what we're saying is I'm not doing it right. And so we have this whole lifetime of doing this to ourselves. And when we hit survival mode is usually when something happens. So maybe it's a big promotion, and usually it's something good that happens, but sometimes it's not. So a big promotion, the birth of a child. Sometimes when something like this happens, then we have this really elaborate house of cards that we've set up for ourselves based on false beliefs and based on, our neurotransmitters getting out of balance, which is our serotonin and our dopamine. These chemicals in our brain get out of balance as we go through life's experiences. And then something called our vagus nerve gets out of balance as well, which is our sense of safety in our body. So, if we're constantly looking around, worried about the next shoe, when's the second shoe going to drop? So something like a pandemic can really bring that about and be like, okay, now my whole world is shaken. And this carefully elaborate plan that I've set up for myself, this house of cards that I've erected to make it seem like I've got all my stuff together. I've got all my ducks in a row, and we've got this set up. But when one thing happens, then all of a sudden everything comes tumbling down. And so what that might look like is more anxiety. It might look like more pressure on ourselves. It might look like feelings of lack of self-worth. Oftentimes, though, it manifests in things like, I just have to try harder. I have to bootstrap. I have to pull myself up. I have to get up off that couch when I don't feel like it, or sense a greater sense of fear. So if we notice that things that didn't necessarily bother us before, maybe we're snapping at our children more often, maybe we're being harder on ourselves than we normally would have. And so I can describe it in 3 layers of our nervous system. So survival mode, basically, the top layer of our nervous system, I describe it in terms of a ladder. And the top layer is what we call ventral vagal, or rest and reset. And that's where we're just sort of calm and relaxed, and we can interact socially, and our brain is able to plan and execute the plan, and we're able to just function like we normally would function. And then there are 2 others that are not restful or peaceful. And one of them is a sympathetic nervous system state, excuse me, which is what we call fight or flight. So we're recognizing that there's potential danger happening somewhere, and it might just be right around the corner. And I describe it often like little meerkats, if you know what that is, where they're just constantly like looking around, and when one sees potential danger, it alerts the rest of them, and they all jump down back in their hole. So we're always on that sense of alert. We're always on that sense of, oh my gosh, there's potential danger around every corner. So that is the sympathetic state, or fight or flight. And then there's a third one that's called dorsal vagal, and that's shutdown mode. So what what that might look like is just not just withdrawing, not wanting to spend time with our family anymore, just sitting there scrolling through our phone or zoning out with our favorite safe show. A lot of people have a show that I don't want to deal with the world right now, so I'm just going to put my safe show on. Just eating comfort foods that, just make us feel. So dorsal vagal is a sense of impending doom. This is when the danger is imminent. And we're just we just play dead like a possum. We just that's it. We just keel right over, and I can't move. I can't get off the couch. So oftentimes what happens when we're in survival mode is what we notice is that we're bouncing back and forth between fight or flight and dorsal vagal. So we're in fight or flight and shut down, fight or flight and shut down. And we never really get back to that sense of rest and digest or rest and reset. And a lot of times the way that we'll know if we're in it is when I say to you, what do you do for fun? What is your joy? What is your passion? And a lot of women will look at me and say, I have no idea. And that's oftentimes when we know that we're in survival mode, and some of us have been there for a long time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So how do you know, and I think you kind of touched on this when you were talking, but give me a couple of really specific bullet points. What's the difference between just being really stressed out, right? Because I can hear some women saying in their heads, I'm just stressed out. I'm just stressed out. I'm not in survival mode. What's the difference? Yeah.
So oftentimes it's severe anxiety, depression, and just not being able to get back to a sense of calm and safety. So if we're finding that we're not enjoying our life more than we are enjoying our life, and even if we think back and we think, I can't really think of a time when I actually just relaxed and just enjoyed the moment, as opposed to constantly being on edge of them forgetting to do something. Or so if you're in the state where you don't feel like you can get to a state of relaxation, or you spend the majority of your time not in a state of relaxation or peace, what we call just sort of like equilibrium, then you're probably in survival mode. And there's no real line. Really, it's just your ability to be able to cope. If you feel like you're hanging on by your toenails and you don't know if you can take another blow, then chances are you're in survival mode. That's what we call, just being overwhelmed to the point of, I just can't. If you're blowing up over little things. So, my daughter used to do this and it didn't really bother me all that much. Now when she does that, it really drives me crazy and I lose my cool. So if you notice that you're exploding more than you normally would, or you're not handling your emotions the way that you did, or if you're suppressing your emotions. So if you normally are able to, say, I'm going to get upset. I'm upset about this, and now you can't do that anymore. Then that is a symptom of being just on, really just clinging to the edge. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I remember about a year and a half ago when I really started down this whole healing path, and I separated from my husband, and I had to consciously teach myself how to relax, like how to rest, because I didn't even know how to do that. And it was a couple of months of having to consciously give myself permission to just sit down and relax and not be doing anything productive, so I understand there's I know it's a fine line, right? That's not always clear what mode you're in, but I was really identifying with a lot of what you were saying.
Yeah.
So
you just feel like you can't, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it just feels like you can't get your head above water. You come up and you gasp for air, and then you go back under again. And you come up and you just take a gasp for air, and it just kind of feels like you're constantly treading water faster and faster and faster and getting less and less oxygen.
Yeah. So you talked about being on high alert, and that meerkat analogy that you gave. And one of the things that I was thinking when you said that is, I feel like oftentimes we justify that in our own heads because maybe one time something did happen. There have been past experiences that have gotten us to that point, and we feel that we're justified in that kind of reaction or that sort of state because of past things that have happened. So what does that look like from your perspective as a practitioner?
Yeah, that's important. So when something happens, and say, we could call it like a trauma or some kind of an insult. we have to look at what the story that we're telling us about that thing. So usually it's not the thing that happens. It's the story that we tell ourselves about it, of what could have happened and what that means about ourselves. So let's say that, we're worried about our child getting lost in the mall. It's not the fact that, okay, our child is around here somewhere, and, I'm going to, find my child, and people are going to help me find my child. So, we're moving into stories that we tell ourselves. My child, this could happen, and that could happen, and this could happen. And then people might think that I am people might think that I'm not paying attention. People might think that I'm a bad mom. People might think that so it's the stories that we tell ourselves that is really what we're afraid of. Not to say that there's not a component of obviously being afraid of our child being gone in the mall, but the potential for that happening. And so I equate it to a lion and a deer. Excuse me. And we are primed especially when we're in survival mode, we are primed to look for the lions, when really the act of, getting lost in the store is probably a deer. More than likely, your child is just hiding in a clothing rack, or, it's not likely that the lion has happened, that your child is not going to be found, right? And trigger warning, I should have said that first. But the issue is that we really have to get to what are we really worried about? And we don't do that by looking at that specific event. We do that by looking at events from our childhood when we had not that same thing happen, but when we had that same emotion of, oh my gosh, and then we have that overwhelming sense of fear. And then what we do is we put in from that point on. So, my child got lost in the mall. From that point on, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to make sure that they're, tethered to me at all times. I'm going to make sure that, I give them a really stern lecture, because they need to understand that they need to stay beside me. So we put these fail safes in place, which are barriers because of our fear, right? And so, we're getting ourselves in deeper when we do that, as opposed to looking at it and saying, okay, that might have been an overreaction, and maybe it was the stories that I'm telling myself about this thing that I'm reacting to instead of the actual event that happened. But also, what we look at is when we can go back in our history and find that emotion where the story that we told ourselves, when we can find that. And it's kind of a long process, so it's not really something that I can go into here. But
Right.
when we're able to go back and do that inner child work and soothe the child that had those feelings that we related to the time when our child got lost in the mall, then we don't have that same reaction the next time something like that happens. So when we heal those parts of ourselves that had that belief about ourselves, I'm careless, I'm inattentive, I'm all of those things that I already believed about myself, and now here I am, I lost my child, and so I'm bringing confirmation to the idea that I already had these ideas about myself. Right? Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have those fears, we can look at what we're actually afraid of. And when we can go back and heal those fears from our past, then that helps us heal our fears in the future. Now, having said that, a lot of those fears also are sometimes because of a neurotransmitter imbalance. If we have certain genetic variations in our body, then we are primed sometimes to react more fearfully to certain events that happen than other people might be. So we look at certain genes, and then we look at what's actually, in another test, we look at what's actually happening with those genes, so that we can say, okay, this is why you react so intensely when something like that happens, whereas this other person over here might not react that intensely, right? And when you have that intense reaction, that brings that forward into the future, where we're going to be more fearful of it happening again, because we want to prevent us from having those intense reactions. So again, that's our vagus nerve, it's our neurotransmitters, it's the beliefs that we have, and we can never get rid of those fears entirely, because having our child get lost in a mall or wherever is a valid fear, right? But what we can do is we can bring our baseline down so that we have more of a buffer. So that if something like that happens, then we have a cushion where we're not elevating to this point, we're elevating to this point, and we can see things more in a realistic position, as opposed to jumping right to the worst case scenario, which precipitates our fear in the future as well.
Right, because once you get into that mode,
Yeah.
when you're in that mode and you think your child's lost in the mall, that is not the time that you're
Right.
going to be able to rationalize anything or change your reaction.
Right.
It's work that you have to do outside of that moment.
That's right.
To prepare for the next moment.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you in a minute about some things that we can do to help start getting ourselves out of survival mode. But before I do that, what I would love for you to do is paint us the before and after picture. So we're in survival mode now, right? We realize we're starting to, listening to this conversation, starting to recognize that. But paint us the picture of what the other side looks like. Like, give us that, like, if we do this work and someone's working with you and they're getting through this, they're getting out of survival mode, what does that look like?
I love that question. Thank you for asking that. Wow. So on the other side of it, our brain is no longer hijacked. And what I mean by that is when we're stuck in a fear cycle, our brain is only thinking fear, 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 fear. And so we can't, our executive functioning is all messed up. We're having a really hard time planning our day. We're having a really hard time executing that plan. And then our relationships with other people are very, it's not, we can't develop a deep and connected relationship because we're constantly thinking about fear, right? And so if we're not in a rest and relaxation place, then having a social interaction that you and I are having right now just probably isn't possible because we're scattered, we're unfocused, we're thinking about other things that could potentially be happening in the background. So what we can do is really find who we are. And when we've been living in that place for a really long time, we've lost touch with who we are, and we've lost touch with the unique gift that we have, and we've lost touch with who we actually are able to be underneath that mask because we wear that mask of fear, right? And so once we remove that mask and we're saying, this is who I am, and it's okay for me to be this person that I am, well, then what we're doing is we're removing guilt. We're removing shame. We don't have that anymore. We're enabling ourselves to step into what we call agency. So we're not looking at other people as constantly attacking us. We're looking at ourselves and saying, so if I have a situation, for example, where I would normally be offended by something that someone says, what I can do instead, when I'm no longer on the alert and on the defensive, I can take that information that someone's giving me about myself, I can weigh it and say, is that something that I should think about, or is it something that I can just release, right? So we can have those moments, and when we have that, then we're able to set boundaries. We're able to hold those boundaries without guilt. We're able to step out of people pleasing, so we can say no. We're able to think about something that someone asks us to do, and instead of saying, oh, well, they might not like me if I don't do that, we can say, that doesn't align with me, really. And, I still love you. Not that we would say that specifically, but what we're thinking is, I still love you, but I don't want to do that right now. I want to be true to myself. And so once we get into that place, then the sky is the limit, and our passions start coming out again. And we start remembering the passions that we had when we were children, and we start finding new passions because now we have all of this space in our brain to be able to work on ourselves and take our own wants and needs into consideration and allow our true selves to come out. And that is really powerful and one of the important things my message is that every single person has a unique message and a unique way of saying their message, even if it's similar to somebody else's. We all have our own unique way of saying what it is that we are here in this world to say. And when we have that space, when we have that lack of fear, and when we have that, it's not even bravery anymore, because when there's no fear, then we don't have to be brave. It's just natural. It's authenticity. And when we have that authenticity, then we're able to just share our gift with everybody and not worry about how it's going to look or what people are going to think of us.
Okay. I love that. That's very true. I can see how that has played out in my life in the last couple of years of really identifying with what you were saying. So before we get into these practical steps that someone can take to start making some changes, give me the 50,000 foot overview, because I know this is going to be very detailed and nuanced, but give me the 50,000 foot overview of biologically what is happening in our bodies when we're in survival mode.
Okay. So what we would be looking at is going into, say, fight or flight. So survival mode is kind of like an overarching state of being. But then we have little instances of fight or flight that happen. And so what happens when we get into one specific instance of fight or flight? So something happens, our neurotransmitters fire, and then that releases chemicals into our body. And those chemicals indicate that we need to get ready to run. So once that happens, we might get sweaty. Our heart might start beating faster. Our breath might go quicker. We might have a hard time exhaling because that signals our body that, we have to retain our reserves in order to run. So then that affects a whole lot of things, especially our cortisol. And cortisol is really, really important to our body for lots of different reasons, but it affects our sleep quality. It affects our ability to heal. It affects our immune system. So having over and over bouts of injections of cortisol, what that does is, so in the short term, it can make us very, tired. After we have a bout of fight or flight, we're exhausted, right? But in the long term, it can potentially deplete our cortisol reserves. We could go into something called adrenal fatigue. And then that's when, often when we see the shutdown mode. So bouncing back and forth between fight or flight and shutdown, that can obviously have some significant effects on our cardiovascular health, our brain health. So, we might be experiencing brain fog. There's lots of negative of health repercussions that we have of going in and out of survival mode or in and out of fight or flight over and over again. So it's best if we can get a handle on that, and that is through our both our our neurotransmitters and our vagus nerve, and all of that goes hand in hand. And so once we can sort of balance the neurotransmitters, and then we can get our vagus nerve back in tone, then those two things go hand in hand for us not jumping into that fight or flight reaction that sends in that whole cascade of things that are happening throughout our body.
Right. Okay. So you said two things that I hear all the time on social media, and I think that are often taken way out of context, or at least are talked about without a real solid understanding of what it really means. Mm-hmm. And those two things are cortisol levels. Mm-hmm. I hear that all the time. I'm constantly getting these ads for do these stretches to reduce excess cortisol in your body, and I'm thinking there's way more to it than that.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And the other one was brain fog.
Yeah.
And you covered kind of the cortisol, how that works. But just as a little side note here, give us the practitioner definition of brain fog, because it's sort of thrown around a lot on social media, right. I think way out of context.
Right. So, and I mean, different people have different ideas of what that means, but really it goes back to our brain being hijacked, and that can happen from a couple of different ways. One of the ways it can happen is just from our thoughts, and our thoughts getting really muddled up and not being able to think clearly. But again, it's like I was mentioning before about just our brains not being properly fed and our brain being hijacked, right? And so if our neurotransmitters are out of balance, so what that means when I say that is we're looking at serotonin, which is kind of like the happy hormone, right? So when we have adequate levels of serotonin, then we feel happy, but it can also reduce, if we have too much of it, it can reduce our motivation. So we might be sitting on the couch feeling perfectly happy and calm, but we don't have a whole lot of motivation. And so in comes our dopamine. And then when our dopamine comes in, then that increases so we have to keep those things in balance, because if we have too much dopamine, then we could have that mania where we're like, go, 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 go. I got to do this. No, I got to do this. And I got to move over here. And we're kind of like, a ferret on drugs. And we're just, we can't, we don't know where to go. And we're kind of almost vibrating because we have just so much. So that's an excess dopamine. So what we like to do is have those two things that are really in balance. And when we talk about brain fog, what we could be talking about are those things, and our GABA is very important as well for cognitive function. And so when those things start getting out of balance, then we can have what we call brain fog, where it's just kind of like everything is muddled and we can't really think very clearly. Another thing that we didn't talk about that I don't know if it's beyond the scope, but one of the things that causes this sort of muddled feeling where we just can't really process our executive functioning and our task management, all of that is sort of thrown off kilter. And that's really what I mean when I talk about brain fog. And another thing that can really affect that is oxalate levels, which is part of our diet. And so that's one of the things that we look at in our program as well is, what are our oxalate levels like? And oftentimes people who are eating a very, what we call a traditionally really healthy diet can have a lot of high oxalate levels. And so they think, well, why am I experiencing all of these weird symptoms? Because I eat really well and, I'm trying hard to take care of myself. And what we're not talking about a lot in popular culture these days is this oxalate. And I don't know if you wanted me to get into that or not, but it is a big cause of what we call brain fog and just muddled and, not being able to really plan and think clearly, like with a brain that's not hijacked.
Okay, good. So there's a lot of pieces to this. Obviously, there's a lot of mental and emotional pieces, a lot of biological pieces. But for the purpose of this podcast, somebody's listening and they're like, gosh, that's me. Like, I'm totally identifying with everything, the brain fog, the high levels of anxiety and stress, and I'm in survival mode. And like, so what next?
Yeah. So one of the
maybe before they even have a chance to sit down and work with someone like you, what can we do to start healing?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the first, there's so many things. How much time do we have? So from an emotional level, one of the things that we can start doing is stop repressing our emotions and stop judging our emotions. So one of the things that we're really good at, especially as women, I think, is really holding back our emotions and judging them. And we look at, oh, I shouldn't be angry. I should be grateful for all of the things that I have. My life is wonderful. And that's something that we kind of call spiritual bypassing, right? And so we're like, I should be. And we're shooting on ourselves again. And so we say, I shouldn't be angry, I shouldn't let my anger out, or I shouldn't express my frustration because I have all of these things over here that I should be grateful for, and I should focus on that. Well, you know what? When we're angry, we need to express our anger. And so that's one of the things that we can actually do. And we can do it in healthy ways. It doesn't have to be vomiting our emotions all over somebody else. We can find ways that are healthy to just say, hey, you know what? Mom needs a minute right now. I just need to go be angry. And I'm not angry at you. This is no reflection on you, however you want to say that in an appropriate way for the age of your children. But you just say, I have some things that are going on and I need to be angry right now. And so I'm going to act a different way. And, it's okay for me to act this way. And not only are we giving ourselves permission to not feel guilty and shameful about the emotions that we have, but we're also teaching our children and modeling that behavior for them so that they recognize healthy ways to express their emotions and they're not keeping it bottled up. So that's number one when it comes to our emotions. And then obviously there's the inner child work too that that I probably can't go into at this point. But that's something that we can do that is free work that you can go out and do, and you can do that in the moment. But vagus nerve toning, that's another thing that you can do really quickly. If you're sitting with your face straight, what you can do is just move your eyes. So move your eyes as far as you can to the right and hold it. And typically you have to hold it for about 30 seconds up to a minute or more. What you're waiting for is a really deep breath. You're waiting for some kind of a release, a sigh. And when you feel that, you know that you've hit on your vagus nerve. And then you can try the other side and try it again. But if we practice that for a couple of minutes a day, we can really notice a big shift. I use something called Safe and Sound, which is faster, it's more efficient. It's kind of like the gold standard. It's a listening program to get to our vagus nerve. But we can, so singing, if we sing out loud and somehow use our throat and our voice to open it up. I'm sorry, I hit my mic. Our vagus nerve innervates all around here and in through our throat. So if we're able to use our voice and even go out in the woods and just yell, then that can benefit. And that also feels really good, but it can benefit our vagus nerve as well. But just those little exercises, if we are able to focus on those a couple of minutes a day, that's great. Now, one thing that I want to give a caveat is I am a practitioner. I'm not a doctor, so I don't want to give any medical advice. I don't want you to change any supplements or medication that you're taking without checking with your doctor first. This is for educational purposes only. However, what I would also say is that you can look at some supplements, some natural supplements, if you're dealing with anxiety and depression and that kind of stress. So one of the ones that affects our GABA is passion flower. And so if we're in kind of an acute stressful situation, it might be something that you want to talk to your doctor about, is trying passion flower and just seeing if that's able to help you. Some of the other supplements that I initially would suggest for my own clients, before we do the testing and really know where we're going to go, sometimes I might suggest trying St. John's wort, especially if you're feeling a little bit of depression. I might suggest like a lemon balm. I might suggest a valerian root, especially if you're having a hard time with sleep. And then, or like a magnesium. Magnesium is also really good for that too. So all of those, there are a few more I think that I've included in my freebie. But you can talk to your doctor about those, see if those might be appropriate. If you're on medication, obviously you want to make sure that you check in before you start anything new. But those are some things that are natural supplements that can really, really help out with neurotransmitter function before we get into the testing to see what your body actually needs.
Good to know. That's some really good practical stuff.
Yeah.
So let's shift just a tiny bit this conversation and talk about the internal dialogues that we have going on in all of this. Like, I think so often, especially as women, we're very, we may be in survival mode, and there might be a lot going on that we don't even have a lot of control over at that point. But we tend to try to talk ourselves out of it, or we tend to be very condemning of ourselves. Like, we get stuck in these loops in our own minds that are often very negative and certainly are not helping the situation at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about that. What role does that play, and how can we start to change some of those internal dialogues?
Yeah. So there's a very specific process that I use for that, and that is trying to find the child. I might be able to touch on a little bit of this here because it's pretty involved. But what I like to do, first of all, when we judge our emotions, like I talked about earlier, what we're basically saying is we're not worth it. We're not worth it. And deep down, if we're in survival mode, most of the time we have an element of I'm not worth this. So not feeling worthless, but feeling worth less. Right? Do you see the difference? I'm not, my kids are worth it. My husband is worth it. My family is worth it. My friends are worth it, but I'm not worth it. And so what we need to do, I don't like to say need to because it's kind of shooting on ourselves, but what we could do, is look for what I call the off ramp. So in that situation, anytime I feel a distressing emotion, and what I mean by distressing emotion is anything that's not peaceful, what I can do is sit with that and recognize, number one, that emotion deserves to be there. We deserve to be able to feel that emotion and let it be valid. Whatever it is that I'm feeling, don't excuse it away. Don't judge it. Don't say that, oh, well, I'm only feeling this way because. Don't because it. Just allow yourself to feel that emotion. I can feel how I feel. I'm allowed to feel how I feel. And then we have the option of taking an off-ramp where we don't need to stay there. And what I mean by that is we're allowed to feel it, and we can feel it as long as it comes up. But what we do then is we do the inner work and look at, why do I feel that way in the first place? Why did that situation that happened, whatever that situation was, that kind of triggered something in myself, triggered a false belief? Because it's never the event that happens that makes us feel a certain way. That's one of the important things. So what it is the event happens. That triggers a false belief that we have about ourselves. And that's what makes us feel a certain way. So if we can get to that internal piece of what it is that event made us feel about ourselves, that's when we can really affect the change. So when we can act on that false belief, when we can change that false belief, then what we can do is when that event happens again, we don't automatically trigger that emotion that we're feeling from that event. So what we can do is when we feel that emotion, we can sit with that emotion, we can think about, what does this mean, what that I'm saying about myself? Like we talked about when we talked about, losing our child in a mall, we talk about, well, how does that make us feel about ourselves? What do we believe about ourselves? We believe that we're not paying attention. We believe that we're a bad mom. So if we can go in and find out where those false beliefs came from, talk to the child that developed those false beliefs, then we reparent them. We have a compassionate communication. We apologize. I'm sorry that you felt that way. It was never the truth. We can forgive the child for feeling that way. I forgive you for having that belief that has affected me all these years. And then we can have that compassionate communication that says, the truth is that this is what actually happened. This is what actually happened. This is how you misinterpreted that event. You have always been loved. You have always been worthy. And when we can talk to ourselves that way, as if we're talking to a little child or even one of our little children, if we can visualize it that way, then what we can do is change the opinion that that child had of themselves so that when we're going forward, we can bring that along with us. We're actually changing what we're feeling in our subconscious, because none of this is happening in our brain, our conscious mind. We can consciously think, of course I'm a good mother, right? We know in our conscious mind, of course I'm not. Of course, sometimes I have my moments where, I'm inattentive, but it doesn't mean that I'm a bad mom. But in our subconscious, we have these feelings of worthlessness. And so when we can go back and change our feelings of worth, then we can affect real change on our lives. So that's what we can do.
Yeah, and I was thinking as you were talking, like one of the big, that scenario of the child in the mole, one of the big emotions I think that would come up would be shame. Like we would be feeling shame.
Yes.
And in that scenario, the reality is if your child hides in the clothing rack and you think they're missing, that's not something that you should feel shame about. And that's how you know, like for me, when I started really doing this work, that's how I knew that there was an underlying belief there. There was something that I was believing that was causing the shame other than that specific circumstance, because that kind of thing happens. Like 3-year-olds hide in clothing racks. It happens. Like that is not something that as a mother I need to feel shame about. So one of the things, the keys I think in starting to unpack this is when you're out of that situation, not then, you can't do it then. No. When you're out of the situation, going back and looking at that and saying, how did I feel versus what was the circumstance? And are these two things really correlated or not? And very often I think we find that they're not.
Most often they're not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, that's not to say that there aren't real fears out there, of course. There are real lions. But nowadays, what we're doing is instead of seeing, 99 deer and 1 lion, we're seeing 99 lions. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And like you said earlier in the conversation, sometimes things like social media make this so much worse because we're now seeing the best part of everyone's life and not, like we're doing a lot of comparing. And 2, we are so much more aware of all of these things, and we start to, diagnose ourselves and analyze ourselves in ways that aren't really that helpful.
Right. Yeah. But also, and on top of that, social media can be a blessing and a curse because also we are more aware, but we're also seeing the very worst things that are happening. And so we get the sense of it's more prevalent than what it actually is. And so we might be more afraid of these things happening because one time this one woman in Indiana or someone who's like 2,000 miles away had this certain thing happen. And it's good to be aware, but it's also good to keep that in perspective of how likely it is to happen so that we're not constantly in the fear of something happening that has a relatively remote chance of happening.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point because we hear, we might hear 3 stories and then we feel like it's happening to everyone everywhere.
Yeah.
But when you look at the statistics, it's still like a very small percentage of the population. It's not as prevalent as it seems.
Yeah.
I had a conversation about this phenomenon with a friend recently, and we were discussing the fact that it seems like lately we hear so many people with cancer. And the question that we were kind of discussing is it really that more people have cancer, or is it just that we hear now about every person that has cancer, right? And I don't know what the statistics are on that, and that's a conversation for another day, but that's the perspective that you're talking about is like, is this really happening as much as I think it is, or is it just that I'm hearing about the anomalies, So tell me what it's like for someone, like if I'm listening to this podcast and I'm thinking, well, maybe I need to work with Michelle. Talk to me about who your ideal client is and what it's like to work with you.
Yeah. So my ideal client, typically, I only work with women at this stage. Most of my clients are neurodivergent, even if they don't know that they're neurodivergent. But it's anybody, honestly, who has the issues of being in a state of swimming upstream and not feeling like they can't really keep up. Now, having said that, my program is not for people who want to stay stuck in a blame mentality. So if it feels really good to stay in a place where, we can blame, I'm like this because of this and because of this and because of this, and I can't change any of those things. We call that an external locus of control, which means that all of these things are happening and there's nothing I can do about that, so I can't make any changes in myself. So I can help you shift that. But if you're very committed to being stuck in that place, and aren't able right now to see your way clear, then my program probably isn't best for you at that stage. Yeah, go ahead.
And I like that you said that, because when you're talking about some of these like lab tests and medical tests that play, things that play into this, medically speaking, yes, oftentimes we don't have any control over that. However, I could see where some people are thinking, oh, maybe there's a medical reason that I'm like this and it's not really my fault, right? Yeah. So what you're saying is that that's a factor, but yet you still have to take responsibility and work through that and deal with it.
Absolutely. So there are genetic reasons, and there are reasons that are going on in our body that we are more predisposed to certain ways of being in the world. And that is absolutely true. And I can't change that. I just can't change that. What I can help you change is the things that we can change. So, we have to look at what can I change, what can I make better, and what can I just change my mind about so that it's easier for me to live with those things, right? And once we can do that, then we can find peace. Right. But if you only want to look at the medical side and say, I only want to change this, well, I can do that for you. Like I can look at it and I can say, yes, if you take this supplement, it'll help your neurotransmitters, and we can do, the Safe and Sound program, and it will help your vagus nerve. We can do that. But if you're not changing so like I was talking about the snowball earlier, if you're not changing the underlying feelings that, number one, got your neurotransmitters to start being out of balance, that got your vagus nerve to start being like the meerkat looking for danger all over the place, then as soon as we finish, your thoughts that are happening in your brain are going to start making those neurotransmitters go back out of balance again. And so it all plays a part, right? So if we can start thinking about things in a different way and changing our mindset, then once we start getting the neurotransmitters working in the right direction, once we start getting the vagus nerve back in tone, then we can keep it there, because we're having the feelings about ourselves that are changed, and we have more love for ourselves, and we have more personal accountability, where we say, I don't have to be affected by that anymore. I can look at that in a totally different way and not be affected by what that person says, or by what my mom thinks about my cooking, or, what my children do at school, how they perform at school. I don't have to be affected by those things anymore. Those don't have to be a matter of my own self-worth. I can have self-worth regardless of what those things are that are happening around me. So if people are willing to take those steps and recognize that I have the ability to make those changes, regardless of what's happening, then that is what I would consider to be my ideal client, as opposed to someone who is really at the mercy of all of the circumstances in their life and feel like they can't make those changes. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So what can someone expect when they come to work with you? Like, what does the process look like? Is there a consultation? How give me a little sneak peek into being Michelle's client.
Yeah. So I start with a consultation before I even take someone on as a client. So I look at what has their history been, I look at where they are right now, and I look at what their goals are for the future. And then I would say, yes, I can absolutely help you, and this is the way that I can in these, because not everybody needs all the things, right? Sometimes people just need one or two things and off they go. So I like to be able to look at the things and say, yes, I can help you, no, I can't help you. And then we look at how can I specifically help. And so if someone needs the full meal deal, for example, then we would start off by looking at your lifestyle. What does your diet look like? We look at what does your activity look like? What do you like to do? What do you not like to do? What are your passions? And then we would also start doing the lab tests. So I order those tests. You take the tests. We start off with a genetic test, an organic acids test, and then when I get the results from those, I compile those. I make suggestions based on what I find in terms of supplementation, and then we start working on our internal landscape. So we would start working on the Safe and Sound protocol, which is, again, a listening program that gradually increased in infiltration so that we start tuning our inner ear for sounds of safety. And I co-regulate through that. Most of that is a co-regulation process where, like we're talking right now, where, I'm seeing, a kind of a calm body tone from you, and you're seeing a smiling, calm body tone from me, and so we're providing that input for one another. And so that's a very significant part of the program, is being able to have that input and have that safety, that sense of safety in our bodies. And then we would start on the Perception Connection program, which is the inner child work. And for that, we meet 3 times a week for 10 weeks. So it's pretty intense. But we've built a community. We build it's a very small group. I don't take on very many clients at a time, specifically for that reason, because I want to feel the cohesiveness. I want to feel as though people aren't afraid to be vulnerable in those groups. They're not public groups by any stretch. And so I want to be able to feel, for people to be able to feel as though they're comforted and they're safe, and that's a sanctuary for them to really get to the root of their emotions. So we're supporting you on every level.
Yes, it sounds like a very holistic approach, which I think is so healthy and so needed, because, like you said, if you only focus on one aspect, you get done with that work and you end up going right back to where you were before you even know it. You're like, oh, I'm right back there again. So you have a freebie, 5 Steps to Get Out of Survival Mode. Is that a PDF?
It is. Yep.
Download?
It's a PDF download.
Okay, so
yep.
Tell us how people can get their hands on that.
So you can go to any page on my website. I think it's in the footer. Just pop in your email address, your name and email address, and that will be sent directly over to you. I also have a group where we're starting a community. That's one of the resources in there as well. It's on Facebook right now. I'm planning on moving it off because not everybody's comfortable with Facebook. But that's, we do workshops, we do lots of different things in there. But the PDF specifically, that outlines everything that I talked about. It outlines the entire 5-step path, why all of the steps are important, how they work holistically and synergistically to affect change and lasting root cause change. That's the big thing. So it goes into a lot of detail. It's a 55-page book. It's a little dry at times. It's not always my irreverent writing style, but it does go into great detail on what we do and why we do it and why it's really important. So grab that. That's completely free. And so my website is newperceptionwellness.com. And at the bottom of any page, you can just pop your email address in there and grab it.
Awesome. That sounds like a great resource, like a good starting place for someone who has really kind of identified themselves in this conversation. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Michelle, for taking the time to have this conversation today and talk to us. If you're listening and you're interested in connecting with Michelle, I'll put all of her links in the podcast notes, including her website, her social media, so that you can find her, join her group, and get that free download. So thank you for taking the time. It's been a great conversation today.
Thanks for having me. I've loved this. It's been awesome.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Equilibrium Echoes. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit www.coachingwithalyssa.com/podcast. And while you're there, book your free consultation and download the preview of my new book, Marriage is Hard and Other Lies I Believed. I'll see you in the next episode.